Okay, folks, welcome back. This is the last lecture on the healthcare bioethics course. And we're looking at some bioethical issues on pandemics and focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic that we're still experiencing for a year now. And the first part of the presentation is going to be by Siobhan McLaughlin, and then I'll do the second part. We begin as always with a little prayer, and Siobhan has prepared one here. So yes, let's go to that. Is that it?
Readings from the book of Sirach, chapter 3, and it's our duty towards parents. Children, pay heed to a father's right. Do so that you may live, for the Lord sets a father in honor over his children. A mother's authority confirms over her sons. They who honor a father atone for sins and stores up riches who reveres their mother. Those who honor their parents are heard when they pray. In word and deed, honor your father, that his blessing may come upon you. My child, take care of your father when he is old. Grieve him not as long as he lives. Even if his mind fail, be considerate with him. Revile him not in the fullness of your strength. For kindness to a parent will not be forgotten. It will serve as a sin offering. It will take a lasting root. In time of tribulation, it will be recalled to your advantage. Like warmth upon the frost, it will melt away your sins. So that was something to think about and to hopefully substitute our elderly for our parents. And that was why I chose that verse. The next slide is essentially just the fourth commandment. Honor our father and our mother. So part of the reason for talking tonight, I thank Father for allowing me to do this presentation in lieu of the part of the internship, is to discuss the effects of isolation and quarantine on our elderly with this virus. It's been an ongoing struggle, at least with my family and friends. And so it was something to look at a little bit more critically. So I also wanted to thank three friends of mine, Drs. Kenneth Goodman, Robin Chard, Dr. Chard, and Dr. Catherine Sapnis for sort of advising me, giving me some ideas. I'd also like to point out that this is not a scholarly discussion, in that the sources and the resources that I used were basically sources that you could read in the newspaper, on TV, radio, what have you. There are very few. I did use some scholarly journals or read some peer-reviewed material, but for the most part, the idea of this talk is to discuss how we would discuss it with family, with friends, with parish members, if we were discussing it with a group, with coworkers, and maybe other people to consider the ramifications of the isolation. So, and to tie in with some of the bioethics that we've been discussing, Catholic teaching tells us that life is precious, that it has inherent dignity, and that we are to do nothing to shorten it out of convenience or anything like that. So we have to consider the Catholic position that allowing a natural death going forward, letting people live as long as they can, offering food and actually water and sustenance is something that is required of us as Catholics. So the question that comes up, but are we allowed to inflict suffering upon the elderly? And in the case of COVID and the isolation and the quarantine, this becomes a real concern, that in our striving to do what's taught to us as our duty as Catholics, are we hurting people? Very much so. So the question that I have, and I think it's the next slide, Father, is, okay, so to consider the emergency order, this is the one in Florida. It's basically been enacted across the country. But the question I want to ask each of you is if you agree that the emergency order in nursing homes, skilled facilities, assisted living, group homes. So if you agree that the emergency order was appropriate, necessary measure. So I'll just tell me if you think so, if you think it was overbroad or proportional, anything like that.
Well, I was concerned because my aunt was dying in a hospital in the hospice at the time it happened. And they did let my cousin in to see her, but only when it became that obvious she was going to die in the next few days. So, and the priest was not allowed to come in either. So I don't know if she had her big communion before she died. I think the family should be allowed to come in.
Well,
And I don't know how close of friends, but I think that should be the call of the patient if they're able to make that, if they're confident to make that decision, because you can have a friend who is like a sister, and you want that friend with you there if you have no other family. If you have no family, what do? You die alone? So yeah, I think it was too much.
okay, so you were saying that it was possibly necessary, maybe not as proportional as it could have been or as well thought out.
I think it needed to be much more well thought out.
Okay, Louis?
Yes.
I don't have strong opinions about it.
Okay.
I think that oh my God, this is one of those difficult questions. You see the good intentions in both. You see that it's normal to think that quarantining yourself and a group of people will temporarily protect them from any danger, and it's the duty of government to help out, to appreciate that protection. It's in their duty. I don't have to think about a conspiracy theory that what they want to do is actually kill them by isolation or something like that. That wouldn't be my first reason in this country. Maybe if you're in China, you know. So I see the value of that, but long term, that's when it becomes a problem, because definitely we're social beings, and after, I don't know, 8 months, 9 months, 1 year, we have to go back to the table and devise, what is going on.
And that is a very good point, because when I said proportional, so what we were considering when you do it, you would think anything that happens in government, that they impose something like this of this nature. Before we go to war, before we bomb another city, we do a sort of cost benefit. How many civilians will be impacted if we close a harbor? So when we close the economy, went into lockdown, you look at the proportionality of it and you say, that makes sense. If we think about the virus in the very beginning, we didn't know who was affected. It did seem to affect the elderly most. If you think about Italy, second oldest country in the world, that seemed to be where the deaths were occurring. So in the beginning, it did seem to be appropriate. Whether or not, once they were enacting it, that they thought it through completely. But so I think generally people thought, yes, trying to protect our elderly is good. It becomes an ethical dilemma. At what cost are we protecting them? And so the idea of proportionality, I know Father is not a huge fan of utilitarianism, and in this case, it might be what you could say was real a problem. The most good for the most people may not have been the best approach for the quarantine. So I think we can go to the next slide, Father.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Salus Populi Suprema Lex. And what this is a statement that says the health of the people are supreme. This goes back to a case in 1905, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which said the state has an interest and can compel vaccination. It basically had to do with vaccinating the population against smallpox. And people opposed it, and the Supreme Court said no, that the government could do these things, up to and including vaccinating, and this becomes the duty of public health. So if you believe that the government has a right to do this, it's very interesting. Florida legislator, I believe it's Sabatini, is actually filing a bill in the Florida legislature today to actually look at Jacobson versus Massachusetts and say that Floridians, there will not be the state of Florida will not be allowed to vaccinate people or require vaccination. It will not be mandatory. I don't know if he has a sponsor in the Senate. I don't know if it will go anyplace, but it was interesting to see this case referenced today in the newspaper when I was going through Politico today. So in March of 2020, this year, Governor DeSantis issues an executive order. And actually the executive order, just for sort of clarity's sake, is actually was directed by Jared Moskowitz, who is the Director of Emergency Management. And if you go to the next slide, I think it's the next two, but for this one, for the purpose of prohibiting all individuals from visiting facilities within the state of Florida. The purposes of this order includes nursing homes, special services, long-term care hospitals, assisted living, congregate living spaces for the disabled or others. The order applies as follows. Next slide, Father. Every facility must prohibit the entry of any individual to the facility except in the following circumstances: family members, friends, and visiting residents in end-of-life situations. So that would address a little bit of Maggie's concern, but it was not everyone. It needed to be very closely monitored. And residents must be discouraged from leaving the facility. And the reason that I actually chose this and was concerned about it is because my mom, with her short-term memory and maybe increasing dementia now, we couldn't get in to see her. The assisted living facility was a very fine facility. There was no problems with it. They were on top of things that needed to be done, but it was difficult. With my mom, you couldn't make sure she was eating. You couldn't really make sure she was showering or doing anything. She unfortunately would mix up the telephone and the TV remote, and so she would either try to call us, or if we tried to call her, it wouldn't happen. And it was dangerous. And even though we talked to them, there was really very little. You understood the position that they were in. This was a big signs, mandatory. You could drop things off, but it put family members in a very difficult position. It put friends and when people, and how close do you have to be dying? Are you an extremis? Are you at the end stage of your life? So the facilities really had an obligation to obey the law. On the other hand, it was difficult for family members. What eventually happened with my mom, even though she was on the second floor and had a balcony, we could talk to her from the ground floor and yell up, which isn't optimal. But she fell, she hit her head, and I thought I would bring her back to my house until after Easter. After Easter is now probably not until St. Patrick's Day of next year. She, you could see the deterioration in just 4 weeks at the assisted living. And so it puts family members in a bind. It is not something that you wanted to do. It did not seem proportional that perhaps facilities and the government, especially after the first 30 days, the lockdown in Florida lasted 6 months, and it was very, very difficult. So you can see that facilities could have used something, restricted visiting, maybe every couple of days, maybe the same family member. There was sort of measures that they could have taken to make this situation more palatable to the residents, to the family members, and to the people who could possibly be exposed to the virus. Because honestly, we didn't know. And if you remember, if you brought packages, they sat outside. Things were being sprayed, they were being left, you couldn't go in, people were gowned up. So it really did become a problem initially. I don't think that Governor DeSantis and other governors really thought through some of the consequences of the lockdown. Certainly, I think it's true that every governor, every elected official probably did what they thought was best. I think I wear my politics on my sleeve, but I don't think it's unfair to say Governor Cuomo in New York, who's really being, heralded as a hero and working. I mean, they had a tragic mistake in letting the COVID patients, the elderly COVID patients from nursing homes go back to the nursing home. I don't think he did it out of malice. I think what the information he was getting is what he did. Other governors did not enact the lockdowns, the requirements for PPE, but I think everybody tried to do the best they could with the knowledge they had and with whatever political background, knowledge, education they had. So I think in the beginning we can say that everybody did their best, and it'll be for historians and other people to decide when we look back in this year, because there were certainly some very difficult decisions. Next slide, Bob. Okay, so when I spoke with Father about doing this presentation and I was going to do the elderly, Father suggested that I perhaps limit it to Broward and Dade County. So in Florida, the population, 18 million people, Dade 2.8, Broward almost 2 million. 65 and older are 21% of the population of Florida. Broward County, we're a little older, 22%, 16% in Miami-Dade. There are 4,000 plus in nursing, living, group homes, assisted living facilities, and across the state, there's approximately 85,000 beds. So that's an awful lot of people to keep locked up, to keep in quarantine. And it wasn't just in the beginning, they restricted the visitation. As the virus got into nursing homes or assisted living facilities, they enacted strict quarantines, and then residents were restricted to their rooms. Once they were restricted to their rooms, you had to bring food in. There was no socialization in dining rooms. There was no walking down to a dining room. There was no going outside to get fresh air. These were people, approximately 85,000 across the state, who were put into essentially solitary confinement. Next slide, Bob. So as of yesterday, in the United States, we have more than 13.7 million cases with almost 270,000 deaths, and that was at, I think, 10 o'clock this morning when I did this slide. And just the United States is 4% of the world's population, but we have 20% of the deaths across the world. That is really significant. In Florida, as you can see, 7,300 deaths. Dade County leads the state, and actually Palm Beach is next, and then Broward County. And right now, Florida has, unfortunately, ranks third in the number of deaths behind Texas and California. California's rate of infections is just astronomical. It is serious, and in the last 3 days, we've had more than 5,000 cases per day in each of those 3 states. So it's still a problem. Okay, Father, next one. This is just briefly, the reproductive rate is a way to calculate and how it is spread. Ideally, it should be 1 less. Positivity rate is what people have been looking at, and that basically is you look at the number of people tested or the rate of infection. If the number is going up, some people will tell you it's because you're doing more testing. I think most public health people will tell you it is not just the number of people who are testing, it is that community spread is just astronomical, that there is actually no way to really even measure it anymore. The positivity rates are just skyrocketing. Next slide, Father. As of the 23rd, this slide I think I did. Could you go to the next one, Father? That one I have to double check. So this, going back to a story from the Washington Post where people were banned. The consequences of the isolation, experts said, would be devastating. 40% of the people who live in these facilities have some form of dementia or Alzheimer's. So now you are isolating them. You are not really checking on them. If your family's not there, you're not that extra eyes on, and it becomes a problem. There is no way to supervise. There is no way to really check on these people. If you think about the nursing home, caregivers are essentially lower paid people, not necessarily poorly trained, but they are the people who will do the hard work. And they are usually immigrants or people of color. And you have just increased their job responsibilities tenfold, put them at risk for the virus because of the population. And now, as you put them at risk and you double the work or triple the work or increase the rate tenfold, it becomes just a huge problem. And how do you care for the elderly in those cases? Next slide. So the question is, social isolation and loneliness, are they the same thing? Think so, Maggie?
I think one can become the other. I don't necessarily think they are one and the same. I think you can be lonely in a crowded room.
Exactly.
I'm lost.
I think that loneliness is more personal quality. It's your temperament, maybe that you want to seclude yourself naturally. You gravitate towards being alone, and social isolation is a social construct. It is something that you impose on people, or that's circumstantial.
Right. The loneliness is actually the emotional feeling. It is the physiologic response to many things. And as Maggie pointed out, you can be alone in a crowded room. And solitary is not necessarily the same thing as being lonely. And people can do. But the social isolation was truly something that we did to these people, to the elderly, by putting them in their room, by not seeing people. Now people come in and they are masked, they are gowned, you don't really know who you are. There's no physical contact unless they absolutely had to. It would be minimal. The New York Times had a story of a lady who was dying in her room, and the aide took off her gloves knowing she could be fired to hold a woman's hand, because that was the last thing that she would remember. And so we know that touch is so important. When you look at the studies of the Reese monkeys, who basically, on the wall, and they've been taken away from their mother, it's that bonding, a newborn that feels on its mother's belly, that touch, that human touch is so important. And we essentially allowed people, and initially, again, 1 month may have been, we were looking at it, but then the 1 month became a second month, and then it became a third month. And we have to really look at what point was somebody saying, this is not good. Experts know that loneliness, isolation is a huge problem. It is a terrible problem in the elderly. It is a problem for single people. The cohort that is greatest for suicide are older men, 55 and older, single older men. So you look at that, and now you put them in a nursing home, and there's no going out to the store, there's no getting the mail, there's no walking down to the pool or walking outside. It becomes a terrible, terrible thing that we have imposed on these people under the guise of trying to save them, to keep them alive. So do we keep them alive to be miserable? We keep them alive, and then there are physiological problems that happen. There are consequences of people not being checked on. An elderly gentleman that I'm his power of attorney and have been a friend of his for 30 years and essentially his surrogate for healthcare, walk and talk, feed himself. I don't know how much he eats in the room because we can't see, but the staff had told him they needed to keep the masks on when they're in the room with the staff member. And I get a call. The gentleman has pressure sores behind his ears because he didn't take his mask off. He didn't know enough to take his mask off when they left the room. They may have told him, but he forgot. But certainly that is something that, I'll tell you, my nursing friends and I were like, wow, that is something we just did not expect to hear. You expect people to have bed sores or pressure ulcers, unfortunately, on their bottom, on their hip, if you can't turn them. But to hear somebody from wearing a mask to have a pressure sore was a pressure ulcer was very scary. So that the next one's bottom. But as Pope St. Paul II told us, suffering is inseparable from our existence on this earth. So I think the question is, do we have a right to inflict this suffering on people? Was this the right thing to do with the quarantine and the isolation? Was this something that we should have allowed as the children or the caregivers for these elderly people in place of our parents, as citizens, as people? Should we have allowed this to happen or to continue? And I think it's an ethical question, and I think we should consider it completely. That it's one thing for me to choose to suffer or to suffer and put it, but it is something entirely different to make a whole group of people suffer under the guise of it's good for you or we're doing the best for you. That sort of position, I think, is anathema to some people. Louis?
Well, I don't know, while you were talking, an analogy was forming in my mind. This is at a social level, but at an individual or a person level. Imagine a mother that is about to give birth, and it gets so complicated that the life of that woman is in danger. What do you do? Who do you prioritize? The baby or the mother? And this is an extreme situation, very extreme situation. Definitely, you cannot have both. What do you do? I mean, is the responsibility in this situation of saving life, where do you put your, I guess, your values on the baby, on the principle of all life are important? We have to save all babies, or you have to sacrifice the baby for the mother, because the mother can have all babies saved. But you're going to lose something. And in that case, you're going to lose something. What is the responsibility of maintaining this population from getting the virus or spreading the virus versus their own life, one by one, their quality of life, that it deteriorates to the point that they die from something else and in a miserable way? That's the question. That's the ethical question. What is that balance? Where do you strike that balance of the social responsibility of keeping them secure versus where you're actually inflicting by the very action of protecting, which is a deterioration of the quality of life that leads them to actually maybe something that they don't want to die that way. Miserable, lonely.
Miserable, lonely. If you think about what someone who's in a nursing home where they're isolated, it isn't just one system. Obviously, we all kind of probably, I'm sure I did, let's just put it that way. You didn't know which day it was. I mean, that sort of joke, every day is the same day, and it's just like Groundhog Day. So now you're in with the elderly, you know, I'm at least getting up and fixing things for my mom and reading the newspaper, perhaps someone in a nursing home. So they gradually become disoriented. After they become disoriented, they become more confused. And it's a steady downward slope. Their strength, they're not walking to the dining room, and they're not walking, so then they become stiff. Their musculoskeletal system starts to deteriorate. Therefore, they're not moving. Therefore, their circulation starts to fail. You know, their circulation starts to fail. There are studies that basically show that the isolation and the physiological response happens. Father would probably appreciate this more than some, almost to a genetic level, or at least to a basic cellular level. They were pointing out that the chronic state of loneliness and the sequela basically can cause an inflammatory response, which initially is good. The inflammation helps a little bit, but if it continues and becomes a chronic state, you wear the body down. So again, your point is, Louis, we don't know what the point is that stops it. Yes, a month may have been appropriate. So maybe it's 45 days. After that, you start to say, wait a minute, what are the risks and the costs associated with this? And there's just, I mean, I don't know the answer, but I think we have to realize that the consequences of loneliness and isolation are not something that just came up and people discovered in the last 6 months. They have known about these studies and these problems for years. I mean, this is something that they've documented in elderly care. Organizations go forward constantly looking at research and ways to combat it. you know, the whole idea of keeping people aging in their homes and all of the home health agencies that come, because there is an absolute benefit to keeping someone in their home, to keep them out of a setting in a nursing home or whatever. So, I mean, I think that is part of the issue. Is where is that balance? Next slide, Father. So this is the question. Are we allowed to inflict suffering? And then how much suffering is too much? Do we have an obligation to say, no, this must stop? And if we believe that life goes on till the bitter end, and that we, a natural death, by not doing anything, in this case, are we hastening death? Are we assigning people to die, essentially? And really and truly saying, yes, they're going to die, maybe not all of them, but a percentage, a portion, some of them. So what do we, so should this have been discussed in greater detail before this quarantine and this isolation was imposed? Did government have an obligation to consider that? Did social groups, did advocacy organizations, did public health officials have an obligation to weigh in and say, wait a minute, this is too much, or this isn't enough? I don't know the answer. Next slide, Mom. And this was just a prayer that basically talked about offering up your suffering. But again, I ask you, is it fair to ask other people to suffer? It does not seem to me to be particularly Christian to do this to older people, to any group of people. 1844, and to offer it up and just hope that it's for the best. It seems to me to be sort of giving up. Next slide. And so an area for further discussion for people in nursing especially, but it's not just moral distress that's discussed in nursing, quite often leads to burnout. But moral distress is not the same thing as an ethical dilemma. Moral distress is when you know what the correct action should be, and you are impeded, forbidden, not allowed to do it. And so it is not just the discipline of nursing, it is other disciplines. And I think if you listen to people in nursing homes, the staff, the ancillary staff, the professionals on the staff, they would have told you that they knew that people were suffering and that, you know, we weren't allowed to do anything else, that we were required to keep people out, that we were required to separate people who've been married for 50, 60 years. We were required to let people, you know, say goodbye to their loved ones over a telephone, an iPad, or through a plexiglass window. And so one of the things about moral distress is figuring out a way to deal with what prohibits you. We understand there will always be ethical issues. We understand there will always be problems. But how do we, and I came from it as the point of view as a nurse, what do we do as advocates for our patients? We need to say this must stop. We need to study it further. We need to advocate better, so this does not happen again. I think that's one more thought. I think that's the next one. And so I'm going to pose this. I don't know if you saw this story of Mary Daniels. She was an elderly woman, older woman. Her husband is in an assisted living facility, and she essentially gamed the system. She had a full daytime job, and she took a job at the nursing home where her husband was living, and washed dishes 2 nights a week so she could go in and visit him. And you think so? Well, so I think the question about Mary Daniel is, did she game the system? She took the rules and she applied them correctly. And she said she knew she was going to do whatever it took to see her husband. And Father gave her the thumbs up. But what would happen if everybody did that? Right. Is that an action that we want everyone to take? I kind of think of her as the James Howitzer of Jeopardy. You know, he took, you know, he knew what the rules were, but he kind of took all the fun out of Jeopardy for me as far as I was concerned. You know, he kind of gamed it out where it didn't seem quite, it wasn't quite as much It was way too thought out. So this woman, I think she gave the system, and I don't know that her actions were honorable, but you certainly can applaud her loving and her husband and doing what she thought she had to do.
Did she actually break any rules or?
No, that's just it. She did not break the
Not
rules.
just on the rules, but on the ethical side.
Oh, that's a question. If I think that's a question that if the action is correct without the consequences, just the action itself, if you would allow it to become the norm, what would happen if everybody did that?
But everybody can't do that.
They can't.
Right. First of all, they don't have enough jobs for everybody's relatives to come work there. So she took the initiative, she figured out a way to make it happen, and she made it happen. Good for her.
Right.
But not everybody can do that.
Because you think about it also logistically and existentially, right? In bioethics, we always have to be very careful with the hypothetical questions that we pose because they may not be realistic and may not actually apply in life. If we follow it through, at some point, some staff or administrator must have noticed, or would have noticed, that the dishwasher is spending hours with the patient. What's going on there? It's not, doesn't make sense, right? Unless there's a connection. So if 2 or 3 more people start doing that, then that's a big red flag. If the institution doesn't notice that their staff is spending considerable time with the patients, that whole institution needs to be shut down. Because of lack of supervision.
Right, but unless you have some regulatory agency putting some clauses on contracts and stuff like that, I don't see how that would be more than an isolated case.
Oh,
an institution.
Yeah,
You
the
know,
only way
personal.
you can get away with it
Right.
is that it's
au
really
contraire. I will tell you, my brother almost insisted that I sign up to be a private duty nurse and yet go in to see my mother, that I should go on, go be hired as a private duty, get a prescription to go in and see her.
Exactly.
Would we want everybody who is capable of doing that? I mean, that seemed to me to be
Right.
questionable. Would it have been served the purpose of checking on my mom? Yes, it would. I don't know that it would have been right. It might not have been wrong, but
I don't see the social harm.
I don't need, and you're a medical professional.
You had the
I mean, you have
opportunity
the reason to be
and you
there.
take it.
Yeah, especially as a nurse, you certainly know how to.
what about other people who don't have children and who are nurses?
Well, life is not fair necessarily. We come with different burdens and talents, and you do what you can. If someone cannot,
And I'm willing to bet
maybe the other
that
person
if
has
someone
other
out there
abilities that you
needing
don't
help,
have.
we'll be there.
You do what you can.
Right.
You're not doing anything illegal. You're not ripping anyone off. You live only once, as you know. Those are precious times where you're not gonna do it if you can. But I'm not saying there might be other reasons for not doing it.
But if,
But
The
I
only
don't see
issue
the harm.
that I would see, the ethical issue that I would see here, probably that would be if Mary would unwittingly actually infect her husband, coming from the kitchen or coming from even outside and so forth. In other words, it's a reason to be isolation, right? It's a health reason. So I insisted on this, would she be putting her husband at high risk? And if so, does she have a right to do that by way of being the wife?
Yeah, but everybody there, they go home in the evening or whenever their shift is over and they come back. So
Well,
they
the
have
protocols they have to follow, right?
Everybody has an opportunity
I would assume the protocols that they need to follow.
If she didn't break any rule, I don't see the problem.
but Louis, there's also a concept we talked about in terms of beneficence and patient autonomy, and there's also the concept of justice. You did point out, yes, we all have different talents, but there does seem to be something, like I said, you're not breaking the rules, but perhaps you are breaking the spirit of the rules as opposed to the law. Other families could do that, maybe not. I mean, I am sure some people, quite a number of people, father, applauded her. We're seeing it. I'm just simply mentioning if her actions became the norm, what would happen, and that's just one of the things to consider.
Okay, but her actions, if they lead other people to do the same thing, maybe that's not a bad thing. I'm thinking of Rosa Parks on the bus, right? Somebody had to stand up and say, or sit down and say, this
We
is
are
not right.
talking about a pandemic.
Right, I understand that, but
I mean, that's the whole
Institution would have to adjust real quickly.
Maggie brings a very good point, because this is an opportunity of the family of participating more into, the life of the elderly, that for other reasons, for reasons that you cannot keep your mom at home, for whatever reason, economic or care, specific care that it needs, but you might keep connected to her beyond the visitation rate that you're allowed. You do that if you can do it and you're willing to work the extra hours. It's an opportunity to keeping that connection. I have my mom. My mom, she's a physician. She works at a hospital in Costa Rica, and she's she's 65 years old. So she's at risk, and she's seeing patients with COVID. That's her life. My mom, she's fully dedicated to care. That's her passion. She's not working because she needs the money at all. She's very well off. But she lived there, and my grandmother still living. She's 91. And she's already mentally, she's slowing down, and she needs care. She's paying a nurse during the day that she's at the hospital just to care, to take care of my grandma. But she knows that there's a risk in what she could bring home to her. And the decision making here is that is she going to put her in a facility? And as long as she can take care of her and spend precious hours and she can afford it, and she found the person that is willing to care for her during the day, she even found a ranch for this lady from Nicaragua. She's been with us for 50 years. She lost my grandma, my late grandfather that passed away 2 years ago. And just to be close and to provide that level of care. But that is a personal decision, and is that fair that she can do that and other people cannot do it because they cannot afford it, because they don't have the knowledge? I mean, you do what you can. And if what you can is participating a little bit more without breaking any rule, it's just a job that you're going to be on site, you're going to be able to see what is happening to your relative, I don't see the harm personally.
Okay.
What I see here is something that you have mentioned several times, Siobhan, during the presentation, which I believe has a lot of merit, which is this. Initially, perhaps, so we went like from black to white, no, white to black. In other words, from total freedom of visiting the homes to total lockdown. Overnight, closed down, absolutely, one extreme to the other. Maybe initially that was justified because we really didn't have a grasp of the full extent of the pandemic and consequences and so forth. But then after a while, maybe perhaps after a month or 2 months, the situation could have been reevaluated and see where at least close family members could be brought in, right? Because perhaps that was missing is a reevaluation of the situation,
Absolutely, Father. Because
somewhere down the line.
if you remember one of the words that I used, proportional.
Mhm.
And again, you are correct. In the beginning, we did not know, and so
We know.
it went to
We are on the side for safety, right?
and absolutely, and saving the elderly, we except, but as we go forward, we look at those things, and that is exactly one of the things that like I said, to keep in mind was the proportionality and the response, and then what can we do? And one of the things, as you're just suggesting, reevaluating. How do we make the protective equipment that people need? We could adjust the visiting hours to one person, to one floor, to do things. That unfortunately will take time and money and effort to come up with those policies, but we can do it. And the question is, do we have the will, and do we want, quote I've heard recently is that the problems are solvable. I believe it was Dr. Goodman at the ethics conference. These problems are solvable, but they're hard, and you need to work at them. You can't just sort of say, oh, there's an easy answer, and we'll have to figure it out.
So limited resources, including intellectual resources. In other words, remember originally there was also the issue of ventilators, right? We were in a crisis mode. Of course, elderly going into ventilators is a very high risk thing. So I can see the lockdown justify precisely to err on the side of prudence. And then we continued in our crisis mode. It's like there was not enough intellectual resource to look at, to do the reevaluation and to pull out of the fight for a moment and see it from the outside a little bit, or from the visitor perspective, right? From the loved one.
Right, and it wasn't until close to 6 months, well, actually towards the end of July, that Governor DeSantis put in this task force to look, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe Ms. Daniels was actually one of the people on it, but it was Secretary Mayhew and other people, to look at it.
Right.
In nursing, we're sort of taught to plan the discharge from the day of admission.
Right.
And so when this lockdown quarantine was enacted is the day that the governor, public health officials, but who's ever making the rules, so the emergency management department should have absolutely started having a plan for how to do this, because as I've mentioned, the idea of the physical and emotional toll of isolation is not new. This is not something that should have surprised them. It should have been something all along. When we went to the lockdown, we knew there was going to be economic pain. They know exactly how much tourism brings into the state of Florida. They know how many visitors. Maybe you couldn't predict with absolute certainty what the actual end number would be, but you did know there was going to be consequences. And this should have been, and I wonder sometimes if we didn't do it because they are elderly, and sometimes in our society, they are not a group of people that we tend to value. Maybe your parents and my parents, my mother, my friends, but as a group, we see them as amorphous. And, Lieutenant Governor of Texas kind of said, 75 and older, we don't mind dying. Well, that is an attitude that seems absolutely abhorrent to us. But there are some people who believe that. And so we need to value every population and look at it a little bit more analytically. I wouldn't say critically, but I would say analytically. Next slide. And then these are the references that I used. They will show some of my political bent, but there were some, like I said, journals there that I did use, the dashboards. I used a few others. And so it was never meant to be a total, it was always meant to be talking points that people could access, that we could use, that are widely accessible, maybe more accessible to me because I read them all the time. But that is the background, and I think for the most part, I erred on the side of science and rationality in looking at them. And I think the last one, and in the words of William Butler Yeats, who's my favorite poet, too long a sacrifice may make a stone of the heart. And I think it is really important to look at the suffering that we inflicted on this population, that the sacrifice definitely was costly. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I tell you put a lot of time and effort into it. Shows highly significant topic.
There's one, can I go on? Sorry, just go to the next slide, which is the suggested readings. I really would, there's two that I would highly recommend.
On the first one, right?
Not that one is just, plague, but I would absolutely highly recommend The Coming Plague by Laura Garrett. She wrote this in 1991 and I read it then. It is absolutely, she's a very very well educated. She's a wonderful writer, truly about some of the public health issues and how we should not be surprised. And lately, we've seen a lot from John Berry on the great influenza of 1918. So that is also one that I highly recommend. Right now, I'm reading Apollo's Arrow, and it's a slog. But those are just some things to think about. Thank you again.
Right. Thank you. Let me ask those of you who are online, if you have any questions, comments, maybe in rather silent for presentation. Ada, B, or Yvonne?
Hello. Hello.
Yes, you have your, why don't you turn off we're getting feedback, yes.
Okay, that's all now.
That's right.
Who's being flamed?
Zoom bombs. Anyway, okay. Sorry for the feedback there. Any comments? Okay, well, I have one parting comment, if you will. To me, your presentation brings out a point very strongly, which I had mentioned also in the course on end-of-life issues, which is essentially the abandonment of the elderly on the whole, right? There's a little phrase, there's no place like home. We see that already over 60% of people in the United States die outside of their homes. Over 60%. Okay? And many of these are elderly. They die in nursing homes or other healthcare institutions. And that's an increasing number, sadly. So it really brings to mind, why is it that we don't find enough time to take care of our elderly? It's not a question, but it's something that I've seen, especially in societies that have well-being, like, for example, North America and Europe. The phenomenon of nursing homes and increasing number of elderly in these homes, which are not their own homes. So we expect strangers to replace the family. And that is something that to me is very sad, really. Sad comment on our society, that as we increase our well-being in general, we tend to abandon the other. Because what would be, in fact, during the second wave now, we actually hear of spikes, or we, at least, I have heard of fewer deaths. Have you heard the same, or there are fewer deaths than the first wave around? And to me, part of that is because there are fewer admissions also. People are, infected people are recommended more to, the protocol has changed for treating the infected people. Is home isolation, right? To stay at home and quarantine, because after all, at least 95, 97% of the infected are surviving. Okay. So why bring them into an institution setting when they can actually heal at home with isolation, but quarantine at home? So I don't know, but I've noticed that shift in the protocol, and apparently it's working.
Well, Father, the reason that I mean, it makes sense if you think about it just logically. The fact of the matter when you didn't know how to treat people. I mean, one of the things that is, people have no idea, just for example, the idea that somebody, I believe it was in Italy or maybe Spain, you know, just looked at the proning of a patient. And we do this in the ICU on a couple of patients. 1 or 2 doctors, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, did it. It is a monumental task to turn somebody, to prone them, which basically you put them on their belly if they're intubated. It can take 6, 7 people to do it, you leave them. But once they discovered that proning people, it actually did make a difference. They have better, you know, they know now because of the inflammation in the clots to use, you know, the heparin because you're going to have the clots. So it makes sense that some of the deaths are going down because the care has gotten much, much better. It isn't necessarily that the numbers have decreased. If nothing else, the numbers have increased, you know, like you said, exponentially. But the care has gotten better. And it isn't that the people are no less sick than they were back in February and March. It's just that our care has gotten better.
That's the point. You know how to think about it. So the number of infected may be rising, but the number of deaths, proportionally, fewer deaths. Right?
There are other factors, and it's just the own virus that tends to mitigate a little bit, and that is normal. And the herd immunity that you create in the population as well. Typically, the most virulent forms, they happen in the very beginning, and then it starts ameliorating over time. So,
But one of the things
and
that
there are
happens,
therapeutic drugs as well. I mean, the kinds of treatments that are being provided once you are sick, they were not in the beginning, or they were first. Now we are better prepared. We're learning.
Agreed. And now that you mentioned herd immunity, I think that's a good segue into my presentation. I want to say just a little technicality. If anyone use the facilities, go ahead. But I would like to continue on instead of taking a 10-15-minute break. If everyone is okay with that. And if you need to do the stuff, go ahead for 2 minutes and then come right back. Right? I do have a little bit to present. Not very slight. What I want to look at is a little more of the global picture. First of all, some nomenclature just to be on the same page with everyone. We'll talk about COVID-19. That is the ICDC, but the virus itself is called SARS-CoV-2, and SARS, the acronym SARS, stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. You're all familiar with this by now. It's been a year. Okay? So, why COVID-2? This one is informative because there have been other coronavirus strains throughout the population, and which are much weaker in virulence. And this is the 6th strain, but the other 5 basically present mild to no flu-like symptoms. All right, so we've had coronavirus in the human population for decades, maybe centuries. We don't really know, but it hasn't been a concern at all. Okay, so it's like a weak form of flu. It is an influenza-type virus, as you know. It's a retrovirus, meaning that it has RNA, DNA, and the plus and minus of that is that it mutates also much faster because RNA is less stable than DNA. Anyway, I also want to point out that in our genome, we have 5 to 8% of viral sequences and viral fragments incorporated into our genome, which means that over evolutionary time, we humans, and practically every species, has picked up viruses that have become integrated to our actual genome sequence. They're part of the human genome, right? And they're called endogenous retroviruses. That's what the third acronym comes from. All right, so that's just a little bit on the nomenclature. I also want to talk briefly about herd immunity, because herd immunity is when the virus is no longer a threat to the population. And herd immunity is considered to be about 70% of the population. So that's the challenge there. And just have a little graph here to show you where that 70% comes from. We have, first of all, a parabolic growth curve. Okay. And on the y-axis, there is a scale from 0 to 1, or a percentage. This can be from 0 to 100% of the population of whatever species we're talking about, in this case, human population. And then on the x-axis is this number R, which Shavanya referenced very briefly. I have to delve a little bit more on it, because R is a technical number that is used by clinicians, and it is the number of people that one person can infect, all right? And it is an average. It is an average. And for COVID-19, it has estimated to be somewhere between 1.4 and 5.7. Those are the two extremes. So the middle, the norm, is around 3.5. Okay, about 3.5. You notice also that this R is okay. So when we do the intersect of R for COVID-19 on the growth curve of the virus, we find that on the y-axis, it projects to just under 75%. And that's how we come up with that 70% there. Okay? And people had a question about how do we reach that 70%, or how do we determine that 70%? So this is it. There's a little reference there. Based on that 70%, now we can do a little bit of arithmetic and see what would be the human cost in death to reach herd immunity for the human population. So right now the human population is about 7 billion. It's close to 8 billion, actually 7.8 billion. So we multiply that number times the 70% of 27, right? We have about 5.5 billion people who become immune for herd immunity. We multiply that 5.5 times the 3.7%, gives us about 200 million people who would have to die throughout the world in order to achieve herd immunity. So this is at a high price. The alternative, of course, what is the alternative to herd immunity? Immunization, the vaccine. See? The vaccine. And that's why the big drive for vaccine, because otherwise, if you just let nature take its course, this virus would have to kill about 200 million people in order for the human population to reach the immunity of the virus. All right. So based on that, I'm just the last number here is to figure out what percentage of the world population would be 200 million people. And it's about 2.5% of the world population. So 2.5% of the world population to become immune from COVID-19 will have to die. To put it in contrast, or in perspective, at the height of the HIV epidemic, which some people claim was actually a pandemic, about 36 million people died. And at that time, the human population, the the human population was about 7 billion. And so that's about 0.5%. And for the flu pandemic, the famous Spanish flu, okay, which is actually pestilent, the numbers were closer. It was between 1 to almost 3%.
So that went full course.
Exactly. That one because
no
we didn't have vaccination capability back then, 100 years ago. It's interesting that it's almost it's 100 years. Okay, so that century, it went to herd immunity and it killed about The average between these two is about 2% of the population, of the world population. The world population was 2 million instead of close to 8 billion that we have today. Another factor to consider with regards to vaccination is that no vaccine is going to be 100%, all right? And this one in particular, which is a flu-like vaccine, is somewhere between 40 to 60%. In other words, 40 to 60% of the people who take the vaccine will actually benefit from it. All right, this is the last slide on the vaccine side of things, which is the alternative to losing 2.5% of the world population to reach herd immunity. Just a bunch of open questions. Now, I prepared this over the summer with some undergraduate students doing some research institute that we have. Some of these questions are a little outdated because a vaccine is about to become available. How soon will it become available? How effective? We see that it's taken basically a year to develop a vaccine, which is kind of the standard rate. How effective it's going to be, like 40 to 60%. Who gets it? At least in the first wave, likely first responders, right? And people who are in closest contact to be infected. How's it going to be distributed? And then determining the vulnerable populations and other questions that come up, even at the social level. Will this cause a social unrest for those who get it, those who don't get it, at least in the first wave, the second wave, and so forth? Will there be a market on it? And many open questions here on the vaccine. But overall, it's certainly a good thing. And in fact, what are we seeing with the vaccines? At first, I thought it was going to be an international concerted effort, a global effort. But no, it turns out that basically each country is on their own. And we're developing our own. It looks like Pfizer will be for us in the United States, but then there's Moderna, there's others, there's the Russian vaccine that has been used already. So it looks like every country is pretty much coming up with their own vaccine. And it's anybody's guess which is going to work better, right?
Well, what happens to developing countries who have no?
Exactly.
They won't buy into them.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's where UN and other groups like that, Red Cross and so forth, all the hope kicks in to make sure that these other populations are taken care of. It really is anybody's guess. I don't see a more concerted effort at the global level. It's disappointing, but I guess we're still under some mode of crisis where basically I see every country trying to make it on their own.
Will the church say something about that?
I don't know.
I mean,
I hope so, but beyond saying, would the church be involved actively? Because we have charity groups like Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities and Caritas International and so forth, which is literally in every country of the world for emergency situations like typically they're natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so forth, and it's part of the first response scheme. Okay, so we hope that this will kick in too. But again, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I wanted to shift now and look at the outbreak itself, because to me the underlying bioethical issue here is really was the virus manufactured, number one, and secondly was the virus released on purpose. Okay. So the outbreak, I don't think there's any question that the outbreak happened in Wuhan, which is the capital of this Hubei province in China. Plenty of maps show that. So this going back to March of 2020, as it was spreading first. It's interesting how it spread horizontally, geographically, and then vertically down into South America. One big issue is that there seems to be mounting evidence that China locked down early, nationally, but not internationally, even before December. But this is a site that has these two maps, they're sliding maps, and let's go here for a moment. They were measuring nitrous dioxide, which is a byproduct of fuel combustion engine, essentially cars, buses. Okay. And this is the little map here. I don't know if it's too small to see, but what's important is to follow this scale. This is December, January, February, and March. So if we start here, the first half of January, this is the coastal region of China here. This is the South China Sea. Here's Korea, for example, for a perspective, Japan, right? So this is the first half of January. And this is the nitrous oxide emission. Here's Beijing, for example. Can you see the little arrow that I'm using? Yeah, okay. So pretty high intensity of nitrous oxide essentially throughout all of China, but concentrated in this region. Now we slide to the, notice how the bar here, now, I get my arrow. Yeah, doesn't go the arrow. I wanted to point out the bar. The bar has moved. See how the bar moves to the end of January? Look at the lockdown. Within 1 month, China essentially locked down. Okay, within 1 month. These are aerial photographs. Yet, internationally, it's just rising. So these are called scissor graphs. China cases from it, precisely. This is, well, because this is a European type numbering system here on the x-axis, it gives the day first and the month and the year, okay? Notice it's all February, beginning February 1, February 3, so each one of these dots on the x-axis is a day in February up until February 29 year, that would be a leap year. Okay. So China was locked down and the cases plummeted. Whereas in the rest of the world, it started that typical logarithmic phase, logarithmic rise. My point of this is, why is it that China locked down nationally, but continued to allow flights, international flights, in and out, but especially out of their population, out to the rest of the world? In fact, not only that, they actually complained when President Trump banned flights from China. They actually complained about it, right? And so they knew that they had an epidemic going in their own nation.
Well, how is it an internal lockdown if you're allowing their own people to fly out?
Exactly, that's the whole point.
Oh.
So what was the interest, right? What was the interest? It's another one that I found in the New York Times. This one is in April, right? Even after the ban, still close to 500,000 people still travel from China to the United States. Just the United States, not the rest of the world. So one has to think, what is the motivation behind this for them to lock down but allow the people to go out to the rest of the world? Okay. So let's look at the virus for a moment. First, it was a novel virus, and soon enough, it was figured out that it was a zoonotic transfer. In other words, it had jumped from a wildlife population into the human population. It's not new. For example, that's how we got the HIV, right? And from SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus from the chimp, that was traced back to Congo in the 1920s. So there was evidence of this human population before, from wildlife into human population. And then, at this point, we have heard a lot about the markets, the wet market. So, doing a little research, we find that this Wuhan, Huanan, Jiangxiang market is actually ground zero for the virus. Here we actually see a ambulance coming out of the market, right? These are the wet markets. These are the Asian wet markets. They're called wet because that's what is used. Water is used to slush the floor and to clean the floor. For example, you can see the people walking here. They have boots on because there's mud on the ground. Okay. Here are bags being sold on the market. These are actual photographs. No question, this is wildlife. Look at this exposure of meat here. With all kinds of refrigeration. You see people walking around in shorts and t-shirts. So these are the wet bottles.
Father, in Apollo Zero by Christosakis, the physician that I'm just reading, he talks about the wet market and some of the, I don't know exactly if they were measuring viral load or afterwards, like antibody titers, but on the other side of the market is actually vegetation, vegetables, whatever. It's not a meat market per se, and their numbers were dramatically different. So they were saying that it actually, probably was the transfer from the animals over, and it had been a long, I would say maybe prolonged exposure. But the people on the vegetable side did not have the same rates of infection or problems that the people on the wet market did. It was really fascinating reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. It follows the biology, right? Okay, and so along the lines of what you were saying, Sharon, precisely, I Googled in the name that I saw here of that wet market, right? This is the Wuhan wet market. So I just picked up that name there, and sure enough, this name that I Googled, so there is a hit, and it is that seafood wholesale wet market. This is one comment that was posted on Time Magazine. Ultimately, though, experts say that it's hard to downplay the problematic nature of wet markets. So named because of the large quantities of water used to slush the floors, especially those that also sell live animals. The mixture of urine, feces, and other bodily fluids from live wild creatures end up mixing with blood from butchered animals, providing ideal opportunities for viruses to fly. This is January 24th of this year. Okay. Now, in fairness, we also eat wildlife here in the United States. For example, this nice bison steak that you can buy online. Bison, otherwise known as the American buffalo. They say it's very lean meat, about 99% free of fat, and our own homegrown alligator meat. It's also salt, that's the wildlife, and we also like sushi, right? But what's the difference? I mean, there's regulation, there's enforcement of the regulation, okay? And seldom do we actually hear about people getting sick from eating wildlife because it's regulated. Another possible source could have been traditional medicine because they also use parts of animals. It's not just parts of plants that they use, right? They also use parts of animals. These are then those just from traditional Chinese medicine. You can see obviously dried-out snakes here and other hoofed mammals, reptiles. Okay? So that could have been another source. Now, again, this image of a market, I don't know about you, I've lived in Latin America. In some places, some rural places of Latin America, I've seen something that could be in a very small scale, similar to this. But
The scale will be the answer. The
Yes.
scale of the market.
Yes.
I doubt, maybe in Brazil, in some favela-like places,
yeah,
but not to the scale, the density in these markets. At the time, there were many videos that surfaced on the internet, and I watched, and it's really hard to swallow.
it is. It's amazing.
At that level, that kind of exposure. Because
Right.
you have mini markets, informal, like even here in the United States, even
Right.
here in Miami-Dade County, in some rural areas, like near Okeechobee, past getting close to Home Avenue,
Immokalee,
there are a lot of
Indian town.
illegal pig slaughter houses and goats and stuff, and the conditions they do that and they sell meat is, very likely to
It's
be
extremely
really
localized.
risky and it's not regulated. But the scale, as you said, and the number of wild animals that they offer, because it's not only the different species of bats, but they have snakes, all kind of reptiles.
The pantagons or whatever they're called.
They have everything, including dogs and cats.
Right.
And they kill it right there, alive, and they sell it, and this is just, I don't know, hard to tolerate. So you just
Actually,
increase the sources of every different animal and of potential disease.
Some Chinese friends were telling me that it was actually after the Maoist revolution that Chairman Mao encouraged the Chinese population actually to grow wildlife at home and to take care of the hunger of the country, just to get into wildlife and raise it at home and so forth, so that they could use wildlife to feed the population. Anyway, I want to point out that Wuhan is not some little hick town, okay, in rural Florida or anywhere else in the USA world. Wuhan is a major capital of China. It's got 11 million people. It's got enormous number of highlights, right? So these are some views of Wuhan. And and China itself is about 1/5 of the world's population. So this is not small town. Okay, this is a major metropolis in China. And also, China itself is not some backward developing country. Here, just a little smattering of Nobel laureates from China. Okay, so they know what they're doing. So what kind of interest was going on? Could have been financial, economic interest, that they didn't want their economy to plummet because of, at that time, what would have been an epidemic, but not a pandemic, right? It would have been a Chinese problem.
We're betting on the Great Reset.
Exactly. The Great Reset. No. Okay, so the next question then is, was the virus engineered? One theory is that it jumped from the wildlife. Another theory is that it was engineered. And just a little, very brief background of the levels of containment of biological labs, biological research labs. We go from P1, we have P1 labs here, which require basically, just basic safety of using gloves when you're dealing with microorganisms and whatnot. Okay, using autoclaves if one is doing bacteria cultures, petri dishes, etc. All the way up to P4 lab, which is the highest containment. And that's exactly what we have in China, in Wuhan, in the same city of Wuhan, right? It's actually called the Wuhan Institute of Virology, WIV, right? CAS stands for the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is equivalent to the AAAS, the American Academy of Sciences. And this is the lab that is in Wuhan. It started as an institute of microbiology, and eventually became the Institute of Virology. It happens to be the largest virus banking lab in Asia, holding more than 1,500 strains of viruses. And the high security P4 lab. And it was constructed with about 42 million, which actually is very small, low, I think. Opened 2 years ago. Now, in 2005, they had published already one paper in Science, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world, scientific journals. They have already figured out that bats are natural reservoirs for these SARS-like viruses, these retroviruses, okay? These coronaviruses. So that was 2005. 10 years later, they publish now in Nature Medicine, an experiment that they did. This is the Wuhan lab, all right? And here's the abstract of the experiment. SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses show potential for human emergence, right? Or human infection. The emergence of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus and Middle East respiratory syndrome, sometimes you see MERS, that's where it comes from, Middle East respiratory syndrome, COVID, underscores the threat of cross-species transmission events leading to outbreaks in humans. That zoonotic transfer from wildlife into the human population. Okay? These are the highest risk viruses. Here we examine the disease potential of SARS-like virus, SHARP14-CoV, which is currently circulating in Chinese horseshoe bat populations. Right? So they knew already that there was a coronavirus circulating in their bat population. A particular species, the horseshoe bat. Using the SARS-CoV reverse genetic system, we generated and characterized a chimeric virus. Here's the engineering. Okay? The engineered chimeric virus that expresses the spike. You know the spike, that's why it's called coronavirus, because of the spikes that are coming off the main body, right? So it expresses the spikes of the bat coronavirus, which is the infectious key, if you will, of the virus. In a mouse-adapted SARS-CoV vector. So this is a chimera. They took a mouse-adapted SARS-CoV virus and adapted the spike, the bat spike, to that mouse virus. Results indicate that a group 2B virus encoding the SHOC14 spike in a wild-type backbone of the mouse and effectively use multiple orthologs of the SARS receptor, human angiostensin converting enzyme 2. This is the ACE2 receptor. The ACE2 receptor is like the socket of the spike, which is ACE2 is what we have in our lungs that where the virus attacks. Okay? It will replicate effectively in primary human airway cells, actually the alveoli, and achieve in vitro titers equivalent to epidemic strains of SARS-CoV. So they did the engineering, they did the test for infectivity, and it gave epidemic titers, in other words, epidemic volumes of virus that could be reproduced in human airway tissue. Additionally, in vivo experiments, right? So they went beyond the in vitro in the lab, and they tested in vivo. Demonstrate replication of the chimeric virus in mouse. So they tested in mouse lung as the model, with notable pathogenesis. Evaluation of available SARS-based immune therapeutic and prophylactic modalities revealed poor efficacy. In other words, infected mice couldn't get healed with the available immunotherapy at the time. Monoclonal antibodies and vaccine approaches failed to neutralize and protect from infection of the COVIDs that they had constructed, that they had engineered using the novel spike protein. Right? So they knew that the vaccines available at the time and the monoclonal antibodies did not work, it was immune to them. On the basis of these findings, we synthetically rederive an infectious full-length SHOC14 recombinant virus and demonstrate robust viral replication both in vitro and in vivo. So they went the full length, engineering the virus, testing it, and realized that it was not, that they had in fact engineered new virus for which there was no antidote. Which suggests a potential risk of SARS-CoV reemergence from viruses currently circulating in that population. That was published 5 years ago in Nature Medicine. There was a comment in the news at the time, an experiment that created a hybrid version of the bat for the virus, one related to the virus that causes SARS, has triggered renewed debate over whether engineering lab variants of viruses with possible pandemic potential is worth the risk. This is 5 years ago. In a major journal in Nature, the preeminent scientific journal of the world. In an article published in Nature Medicine, November 9 is the article that I just showed you, this, the abstract that I cited. Scientists investigated a virus called SHOC14, which is found in horseshoe bats in China. Researchers created a chimeric virus, that was the Wuhan lab, made up of a surface protein of SHOC14 and the backbone of the SARS virus that had been adapted to grow in mice and to mimic human disease. The chimera infected human airway cells. It was published, providing that the surface protein of SHOC14 was a necessary structure to bind a key receptor. The key receptor is the ACE2 that you hear about in alveoli, from the cells and to infect it. Also caused disease in mice, but did not kill it. All right, so it was published. Here's the lab itself. Okay. You can see this is P4, the high containment gear, the positive pressure suits. It works. The lab is here, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Here's the Yangtze River, second largest river in China, and here's the seafood market. This is Wuhan City. They're 13 miles apart. Why do you put a P4 lab, which houses the largest variety of viruses in Asia, in a city that has 11 million people?
Why do we have Fort Detrick?
Sorry?
A few miles, why do we have Fort Detrick outside of Washington, D.C.?
Yeah. Has anything ever come out of Fort Detrick?
Apparently, there was some question about the anthrax.
Okay. So, this is their website. It gets worse. This is their actual website. You can look at it in Chinese or in English, right? The Wuhan Institute of Virology is expected to become the Prevention and Control Research and Development Center of China's newly born diseases, virus seeds, storage centers, and WHO reference laboratory, which shall play a basic technical support role in China's major newborn infectious diseases prevention and control, effectively improving our defense and resilience towards biological wars and terrorist attacks, maintaining the national biosecurity. So they have it in print on the website. So, in the meantime, WHO, which is one of the branches of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, okay, you go to the United Nations and they have an office for disarmament affairs. And they have an annual convention on disarmament of biological weapons. And this is their statement: the Biological Weapons Convention on the prohibition of the development, production, and stockpiling of bacteriological and toxin weapons, and on their destruction. And China is a member, participatory member of this Biological Weapons Convention and signee, all right? So, just want to show you first, yeah, so this is the website where it has all of the conventions, all of the meetings they've had year after year, condemning the development, stockpiling, and development of these biological weapons. So this is an ongoing, it started in the 1970s, and it's ongoing, distinct from nuclear weapons, distinct from chemical weapons. Each one of these has particular characteristics, but biological weapons in particular are especially dangerous to us, okay, for a number of reasons. One of them being that the viruses, bacteria, they don't give off any radioactivity, so they don't need to be detected. They're very hard to detect, actually, as opposed to nuclear material. Secondly, it's much simpler to develop, essentially very easy techniques in the lab of genetic engineering, as opposed to nuclear reactors and the infamous centrifuges, for example, in Iran and so forth, that take very sophisticated technology, whereas here, no, the technology goes mostly into the containment of the virus, but the actual production, the engineering of these viruses, we could do it upstairs, okay, in our own P1 lab. without the safety. So you see, it's a problem, it's a challenge, it's an open question, obviously, but to me, this is the biggest biological issue of the pandemic. First was virus engineered. Secondly, was it released on purpose at the market to fake a natural zoonotic transfer from their tradition of eating wildlife.
But Father,
And to test it.
even if what you're proposing is true or you're,
Right.
discussing, the fact of the matter is there are measures that could be taken that would have minimized the spread of the epidemic, the spread before it became a pandemic, that
Exactly.
were not instituted. So it doesn't really matter if China, I mean, in the long run, as John Maynard Keynes said, we're all dead. I mean, so the problem is, it isn't that China did it. If it did or it didn't, that's right now is sort of immaterial. That's, again, for historians or other people. But what should we have done to combat the pandemic? What should we have done initially? You mentioned that, China let its nationals come across. We closed the border to China, but we, the United States, allowed 40,000 Chinese into the country. Most of the cases in the Northeast essentially were a variant strain that came from Europe.
Right.
And part of that issue was any number of Chinese nationals actually worked in Italy, in Italy and Milan because of the fashion industry. So there was a response that we could have mounted that we chose not to do. And if you look at Europe, I mean, there's a couple of instances you could look at sort of what happens with herd immunity on some of the cruise ships. But more than likely, if you look at Sweden right now, Sweden has given up the herd immunity idea. Lockdowns do work. Boris Johnson did it a few weeks ago, I guess 6 weeks ago. The UK's rates have now dropped dramatically. So there are responses that we could have done regardless of what the reason was that it's here.
Sure.
I mean,
So hindsight is 2020.
yes,
right?
that's
Hindsight
exactly.
is
That's always, that's one of the policies of looking at history and applying the knowledge that you have, right now to the previous scenario, that when really the conditions were different and we were not prepared, we didn't know what we were handling, and there's a tremendous bureaucracy to move, and these people in that bureaucracy are not trained.
Okay, Louis, I
So
mean,
it's complicated.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree that it's
I know you
complicated,
don't.
but going back when Father mentioned the Spanish influenza, I mean, basically, and I have not read Barry's book, so I don't know, and I don't know the true history. But listening to him talk over the weekend on a radio show, he was talking about some cities actually enacted quarantines, mask wearing versus other cities, trying to keep people isolated. San Francisco was much less impacted, I believe, than Philadelphia. Cities were. So there were things, even if generals fight the last war, which is, that's just human nature. We did have some playbooks to fight a pandemic. I mean, and that is not, and that goes back to what I was saying about Lori Garrett's book, 1991. She discussed emerging viruses, and I think, like I said, I haven't reread it. It's on my list to reread. But she very specifically talked about emerging pandemics. Marsburg, Hanta, hemorrhagic fever. So all of these things, it's not like we didn't have some idea. It's not fair to say we're sort of in the dark. We had some tools. Now, yes, we can fine tune them, or we can say, well, that didn't work, or that's last year's war. But we did have some tools that we totally and utterly ignored.
But I think that we did that again. You are putting something judgment really, really hard on this country, and the conditions in this country, both at the government level, social level, are very different from Europe and China. And I think that the tremendous effort, tremendous job was made at the time that we were having so many cases. The death rate in countries in Europe that have socialized medicine and all that was tremendous. They were dying by the thousands, and here it was just a natural spread. That went in the big cities like New York and Illinois, but mostly in New York. And that was very different from other states in the country that are not populous. So it's,
this is the concept of lies and statistics. Per capita, we test more people. We have 20% of the world's death, and we are only 4% of the world's population.
But that 20% death is just because you're treating the whole population as exposed, exactly the same happened here. And that's not true. First, because the testing is not there. You cannot go to Brazil, you cannot go to India and expect that they're going to have the same testing and the same statistics and the same infrastructure that we have here. Here, we make it happen in an instant. But this is not the norm. We're the exception of the world.
We're not.
In other places, you really don't have any access to healthcare and testing, and you just die of whatever.
Louis, that may be true in third world countries in South America. That is certainly not true in Taiwan. It is not true in Indonesia. It is not true in South Korea. It is certainly not true in Japan. These countries have been able to absolutely cut the transmission down to basically zero. Stop cases. How did New Zealand do it? We have 270,000 people are dead because, and some number may have died, but they're talking about there are thousands and thousands of people who are dead needlessly. What did they do? They did contact tracing, they did testing, and then they isolate. The virus is so rampant in our society right now, in our country, it is impossible to do contact tracing. But when you look at other countries, what they did, South Korea, Taiwan, they'll talk about it. They absolutely identified. They have monitors on their phone. They might not like big government, but they had monitors on their phone, and if you went someplace you weren't supposed to, they knew about it. They also knew when you did the contact tracing. New Zealand did contact tracing. We just let it go.
But again, New Zealand is like China, and New Zealand you have 3 million people. And is isolated completely from the world. And the president, I remember when she was interviewed, that the lockdown everything was so mandatory. And you can do that when you have a very homogeneous population, when you have people with same values, very similar, and they all understand and move on board. But this is a tremendously diverse country.
That's the case. Then look at the United Kingdom.
So we cannot sit in the table as equals because we are not.
The United Kingdom is not homogeneous population.
I see how many deaths they had. Even
they had an incredible now, and now that they've gone to a second lockdown, a severe lockdown, you have seen Boris Johnson absolutely stepping away from the herd immunity, and he has absolutely, and the curve has started to drop. In France is another country that is not homogeneous.
Here's my point. You might compare the United States to Europe in general, but not to individual countries. And you have to look at the states and how every state reacted. Because we have a government, but we are representative Republican. There's a lot of power at the level of state.
And if you look at states where it is from, look at Texas. Look at the death rate in Texas. Look at the fact of the matter is, look at states that did not do, I'm not even going to say mandatory lockdowns. I'm talking simple masks.
I agree, but again, you look at Texas and you're putting a state, but probably you have to go to Houston and Dallas and these big mega cities, where it's really hard to lock down so many people living in such dense places.
Wuhan lockdown, it has 11 million people.
But how many people died in China before they were successful into it?
I don't think the
And
population.
what are the measures, the draconian measures that they can implement in China that you cannot implement here without having thoroughly the military on every corner? And that is not possible. That's just not going to happen. It might happen if you have an Ebola-like outbreak, but not a disease like this. I just don't think so. I understand that a lot more could have been done if they knew better, but it's just like you just presented the measures on these assisted facilities. I mean, they tried to do what they could based on the knowledge they had. In the beginning, I remember how the World Health Organization advised that everything was fine. But they had met with China, and that was in all cable news. They had met with China, and they had said that there was no problem, everything was contained, it was not contagious, it was not a danger to humans, and that was presented to the entire world at the time that we were impeaching Trump. And I remember hearing that. And then all of a sudden, those 2 or 3 weeks that passed after those statements by the World Health Organization, all of a sudden it escaped. And people started dying in Europe. And by that time, it was too late. Because it's just a virus and it transmits, it's 2.5 more contagious than flu. And how can you contain flu? And this is 2.5 times more contagious. It's really hard. We can say here that a lot could have been imposed, but where is the balance? Where you say, okay, we lock down, we kill the economy, we kill the country.
No, I mean, lockdowns are absolutely the last thing you do.
Kaput,
Louis,
save
you
the
do
people.
testing, you do contact tracing, you do isolation. Those were the things that you could have done. Those were the things that should have been, those were the low-hanging fruit. I absolutely agree. Lockdowns have been extreme, and if you impose lockdowns, people do not support them, all of them. They game the system, they break the rules, they distrust. If you have people who buy into it. But the simplest things that we could have done were not done. And it doesn't matter if China did it deliberately or if they didn't, or if it was simply an act of God, or the simplest explanation is that it was transmitted from an animal. The fact of the matter is there are responses that you can do, and we chose not to do them for whatever reasons you want to say, and we are now paying the price for it.
That's true. My position is that in order to work well against that threat, you have to be almost perfect. And it is impossible to be perfect in this country, given the different makeup in society, that you are well-informed, educated person. And here, I think that most of us are. But I know people that live here and interact and go to a supermarket and they have a job, and they move around and completely don't understand the responsibility and what they have to do. And they purposefully say, I'm not going to do anything. I don't care.
Well,
And for those people, you will have to have a real, like ironclad government, like a dictatorship, pretty much to make it mandatory. And that, unfortunately, is not the way it works over here. And you cannot overnight change that. They try, but one that escapes, you do it in 100 seconds. And the 2 that fail, that propagates the virus everywhere else. And then
well,
it's
if
out
you
of the
look at
case.
places that did enact something, and I'm not even saying that masks totally work, but places that didn't do it, it seems to me it is far better to do something that might not work than to do nothing that you know is not going to work. So by the simple, simply, like I said, they say hand washing, masks, social distance, physical distancing, were steps that could be taken, but they weren't. And then you start to look at the reasons why. And then you get into some of the social and political ramifications that you talk about. But a unified policy, if an authoritarian government, central planning government like China could do it, there seems to be no reason why we shouldn't be able to learn and say, okay, look what they were able to do with contact tracing and isolation. I mean, why would we, reinvent the wheel?
I think that we're going to do that. I think that you're right. That why we cannot learn. I think that we couldn't learn in 2 months. It was not possible. We were not prepared to react at that magnitude. But look what happened after the Twin Towers went down. And they created this agency to monitor terrorism and all this. And things got a lot safer and better on the protocols in the airports. Before, it was free for all, because you would expect that people would behave well. But all of a sudden, when you have the risk of terrorism, there's measures in place for security. I think that this is gonna happen. All these protocols like social distance and mask, I think that it's gonna continue.
I don't think anybody ever thought it was gonna last. I mean, I thought it was gonna be over in like a month. Who am I? I don't
Well,
know.
I remember initially when we talked about it, I'm one of the people who said it couldn't be any more dangerous than the flu we didn't know, and I didn't agree, and we were talking about it. But when you get new information, you know, again, to quote John Maynard Keynes, you know, when I get new information, I change my mind. I mean, what do you do? I mean, new information should have given us, you know, a chance to react, to do differently. We started learning, we started seeing the numbers. You know, we have not learned from our neighbors, and it's sad that the United States, we lead the world in the number of cases, we lead the world in the number of deaths per capita. It is just a tragedy of events. It's sinful, actually.
In fact, we don't lead the world in the number of cases per capita. This is research that I did with my undergraduate students over the summer, and we actually traced, I'll show you here what we did. We have every nation of the world in column A.
Can you make it bigger?
Down to, let's see, yes. Okay, this is how we did. So,
Maybe Belgium is number one.
230 nations, okay, 231, including territories, and then we ranked them. So we looked at population in absolute numbers, and the area in kilometers square, the population density, see if there was a correlation between population density at the level of nations as a whole, number of infected, number of deceased, and then percentage infected and deceased based on population. Okay. And here they are ranked. Well, here they're ranked by population density, but we can rank by number of deceased. Some graphs that we developed looking at possible correlation with density and so forth at different levels of density. F, column F. Percentage, not absolute numbers, because some countries have a small population. Other countries have a huge population. So we have to look at percentage.
So that's the same thing as per capita?
Per capita or percentage, yes. So it's column H, right? The disease.
You move forward to the beginning just to see the country column?
Yeah, but let me rank it first, because now it's just ranked by surface area. And that's not informative. I want to rank by disease. All right. So now they are ranked, as you can see, they're ranked by disease, 0.1. And perhaps these columns. All right. Here's the United States. We're actually 12 in number of deceased in per capita. San Marino is number one, actually.
That's a teeny country in a world,
Yes, and it's high density, very high density population. It's only 2 square kilometers. Then Belgium, Andorra, United Kingdom, Spain, Italy. 10 out of these 12 is Europe. France, Sweden, Italy, Spain, UK, Belgium, and San Marino. The other that are not there is Andorra. It's also in Europe, actually. And Chile is the only one who's not there. And then we're number 12. So really, most of the deaths per capita were in Europe.
We are dead even with Brazil, which is a similar size country. Just to see how how in size. I mean, Brazil is almost the same size as the United States.
Yeah.
It has several mega cities and other areas of the country that are basically empty.
Exactly.
And look at the results.
For many places,
with less population, 100 million people less.
Yeah.
And look at that, the results. Almost exactly the same death percentage of disease and infected. Actually, it's pretty much the same. And
so we're not unique. It's not that we were the worst. We did the worst.
No, we're not. We're just too big, and the information that is generated in this country is tremendous. So it makes it look like a disaster is happening here. But there are other places that are in a similar scenario, or maybe worse.
Much worse.
Another thing. Look at Costa Rica, for example, that I have direct information on. My mom is working on it. They have socialized medicine. They make mandatory the lockdowns, and basically is several departments managing the entire country. So when they issue any ordinance, everyone has to comply. Different like here, we have 50 different, according to the states. And even though they haven't been able to contain, and they are in lockdown, I had to postpone my trip to visit my mom 3 times already. And now I have to move it, it's paid already, to the summer. See if I can finally go. And they keep receiving patients, and the percentage of physicians that have died, contacted the disease and get infected and die is very significant, a lot higher in percentage than poverty. And the point is, the policies that they have are different. So when we sit at the same table, are we comparing apples with apples or apples with oranges? But we all put it in the table and we compare, but we have to understand the diversity in social system, in culture, in population, ethnicity, all those factors, they play a role. For example, in many countries of the third world, they establish mandatory distribution of some drugs that they have some efficacy in the prophylactic way, but the side effects are horrible. They would never pass the test here, are prohibited. One case is a famous hydrochloroquine. And that was mandatory in many countries of Southeast Asia and Africa. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it, but people have to swallow that pill. If not, you go to jail. It's that simple. Because you basically have no rights. But that's, of course, it's not going to be. It made the headlines of the New York Times, maybe. But it is a fact. And it might have a population result. I mean, when you look at the statistics, maybe the rate of infection drops tremendously, but at what cost? The people that have these bad reactions. So that's something to keep always in mind. That what we are comparing here is this is not necessarily the same. And
exactly. Another issue also about the statistics is that this is based on numbers. The percentage is based on numbers, but how accurate are the numbers themselves? For example, if we look at population, these numbers of population of the countries tend to be more accurate than the number of infected, right? Because maybe not every country is reporting accurately, and the number of deceased may be even less, because there are also consequences. I understand that in China, the number of deceased was suppressed drastically because it had political consequences for the provinces that reported more deaths. They have actual quotas of infected and deaths, and
That's a known practice in many totalitarian societies. They
Excuse
don't
me,
want
that happens in
to
the state
show
of
it as a
Florida.
weakness. And in Florida and many other states, it was actually the opposite. The effect that you see here is the over quantification
right.
of cases. There's no politics on it. This is just at the level of maybe the private practice that some clinics, they actually receive some benefits for reporting that cost, because there was that problem with reporting in many places.
Right,
But
doctors
again,
got
that's
more
beside
money
the
for
point.
saying
That's
people
beside
die.
the point, because if you count, that's fine. The problem is in other countries. That's my point.
But the problem is what you're saying in terms of querying the data happens almost anywhere when you want an outcome. You can look at the state of Florida. The governor keeps insisting we have a higher rate because we're doing more testing. That is not what any public health expert will tell you. They will tell you it is because of the rampant community spread. It is not because we're doing more testing. More testing might give you some of those numbers, but if it's rampant in the community, our rates are not accurate. You cannot trust numbers that people are massaging
So
to give
maybe-
you an end, but it's
maybe
not
it's a
just in the
combination.
authoritarian countries.
My point is that just because we're doing more testing and because it's this widespread, and because you have, the resources in place to detect it, you actually can trust the statistics more than in other countries that I know, that I've been, that they do probably zero, and they do massage the numbers according to what they want to show. For many of these dictators or even presidents or politicians, it is a sign of weakness when they have a problem that they cannot control.
I agree,
And
and
they
like I said, if you
should
look at the state
suppress
of Florida, you
information.
can see that. You can see that in other
But
places.
never at that level, ever at that level. I mean, we're talking here in logarithmic scale. I'm telling you right now, that is something that you have to understand, that what happens in other countries, when we look at that table, you cannot compare what you record in Bolivia compared to the United States. It is or in Belgium or in Italy. You will trust the statistics 1,000% more in these countries than in
And
some
you
of
went in
these.
Belgium?
Yeah, in Belgium, I would trust the statistics from there. And that is obvious at every level.
In Nicaragua, for example, while the pandemic was going on, in the midst of it in July, right, at the parish of Madison Monica Parish, which is not far from here, we have a very significant Hispanic population there from Central America. And the people from Nicaragua there, who had their relatives and family members back home that couldn't visit and so forth, they were getting news that President Ortega basically was denying that there was any infection in the country, and the relatives were forbidden to go to the hospital or even to talk about it if they had family members who became infected. They were put in the hospital, isolated, and the families were not allowed to talk about it among themselves or to tell relatives and friends that they had families infected. People were dying, were not being reported, all right? They were being buried by the government without telling the family members that their relatives had died. And this, I have actual witnesses that were telling me this, anecdotal from people. Those were their family members. One day they were home, the next day they were in the hospital, and the third day they were buried by the government. And that was Ortega. Venezuela, similar. So that's
Bolsonaro
why
in Brazil?
huh?
Bolsonaro in Brazil?
In Brazil, most
You don't think that happened in Brazil?
absolutely,
I think that it happens. in
Okay, at least we're like looking at
yeah.
across the spectrum politically, not just,
Oh, no, but that's what I'm saying. It's not related to whether I'm red or blue. We have to move out of it.
Yeah.
This is a reality in how the systems work, the infrastructure that they
In other
have.
words, we're much more
And
honest
the
about our numbers.
education in the population
Many
and in the
other places.
profession. That's what we're talking about.
So
And
we
that's
see
the
that-
reality that we have to understand.
Anyway, folks, we covered a lot of ground here, a lot of open questions still. We're still in the midst of the epidemic. The second wave is going through. Yet, what I find encouraging is that, at least from my end, I hear fewer cases of death, even though we have a second wave of increasing cases, and yet fewer deaths. So that's very encouraging. It could also be that the virus, like Louis just mentioned, the biological virus, has mutated to the point that it's less infective. Okay. So those things are encouraging. The vaccine is also promising, but we're still in the midst of it. It's going to take time to sort this out. Go back to the original question: was the virus engineered, this particular strain? And if it was engineered, was it released on purpose? Certainly, biological warfare is, from several different angles, much more dangerous to us than nuclear warfare. Okay? Cannot detect it. It will integrate into nature and continue its wave effect way beyond any targeted nuclear warfare that we can think of. And then the next layer of complexity that I see is that because the viruses can be engineered in the lab, right? Then they can also be engineered selectively to target specific ethnicities that have some kind of fingerprint genetics, some kind of fingerprint characteristics where certain populations could be targeted, and the virus could be more virulent there. So another issue with biological warfare is can also be tweaked toward doing eugenics in the population, in the war population.
I've got to go. My sister is concerned. She's got to go home, and I
Sure.
can't leave mom alone. So good night.
Okay.
Happy holidays to everyone.
Thank you.
Louis,
Nice
Father.
to you. Thank
Yeah,
you,
we'll
Siobhan.
try
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I will talk with you soon.
The,
Louis, Father, I will talk to you.
yeah,
Take care, everyone.
basically, I just wanted to
Have lunch.
to the to this point of I leave it as an open question, really, but now we need to look more carefully at this whole issue of biological warfare. We can see the real possibility we may be living it right now, whether we understand it or not. It's a real possibility. Okay, and with that biological warfare, the possibility of selecting certain populations or targeting certain populations with genetic with the genetic manipulation, genetic engineering. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know if there are any other parting questions or comments from anyone. Folks online, we've been particularly silent for the whole thing. I hope you've been able to hear the presentation at least. Can you at least confirm that you presentation? Okay, all right, good. Well, if there are no other comments, then I'm going to close the session. I'll thank you all first for participating. And this is the course. We'll meet again in January, mid-January. I'll send you emails as to when exactly we get started. Right. The two courses that we have going forward in the spring semester are the beginning of human life and end of human life. Oh, sorry, I mentioned end of human life because the previous cohort, the previous cohort, you were totally on that. Okay.
That was nice.
Is the course showing up? Yes.
Don't confuse me.
Yeah, that's because I get confused thinking of the cohort is actually graduating now in December, right? And it's of course a daytime in the spring of this year, so you'll have that coming up. Beginning of life, 8 weeks, and then end of life, the following 8 weeks. Always Saturday morning, principal. Hopefully, we'll be able to meet here live. Okay, but it will still be recorded as always. All right, thanks again. So I'm gonna close it down. Stop the recording.
Good night.
Okay.
Good night,
Good
guys.
everyone, and thanks again for